people's minds and hearts would be shaped by what came from the mind and heart of God, so that people's minds and hearts would resemble God's mind and God's heart. When people received what came from God, people would resemble God. John was being used for this purpose. No one fulfilled this purpose greater than Jesus Christ. He fulfilled this purpose perfectly, but John the Baptist was still being greatly used by God. He was pouring out what he received from the mind and heart of God. And what he poured out passionately, because the Jewish historian Josephus says crowds of people were coming to John. People were being moved by his words. John was being used to fulfill the desires of God's heart. From the beginning, God's desire was to create a world full of people who resembled him, thereby becoming his children. God's desire is to have a world full of people who resemble him, people who pay attention to their God and receive what comes from his mind and heart. So like the prophets, John the Baptist was being used for this purpose. He was being used by God to pour out what came from the mind and heart of God, so that people would be shaped by what came from the mind and heart of God. And when people's minds and hearts received what came from God's mind, and when they received what came from God's heart, people's minds and hearts would be shaped by what came from God's mind and God's heart. And then people's minds and hearts would resemble God's mind and God's heart. John was being used for this purpose, to be used by God to build an environment where people received what came from God, so that in this environment people would resemble God and be children of their Father in heaven. Now sadly, this environment was ruled by Herod Antipas. Now it's very interesting. Mark's gospel tells us that Herod Antipas really enjoyed listening to John the Baptist, an ungodly man who had a very ungodly father, King Herod. Herod Antipas enjoyed listening to John. This is in Mark's gospel. Now Mark's gospel also says that Herod Antipas was perplexed, confused, confounded by what John was saying. And I can only wonder if it was because what John was saying was so different to what Herod had been brought up to believe. John was revealing the truth about God, about who God is, and how God works in people's lives. John was revealing the truth about what pleases God and how what displeases God is destructive to our human nature. And I can imagine Herod Antipas feeling perplexed, confused, because what John was revealing, the truth John was revealing, the heavenly truths John was revealing to people, was completely different to what Herod Antipas had been brought up to believe. He had a father who was a man of bloody ambition, a man who made Macbeth look like a bunny rabbit. His father lived his life for the purpose of building his ego. And here Herod is, living a life he learned from his father, to build your own ego, to live for your own pleasures. And here he's listening to John the Baptist, preaching that satisfaction is found by pleasing God. The truth revealed in what John was saying was completely different to what he had been brought up to believe his whole life. So he was perplexed by this, confused, and yet he couldn't deny the fact that he was enjoying listening to what John the Baptist was saying. But one thing Herod didn't enjoy was when John the Baptist rebuked him and his wife. John the Baptist told Herod, I imagine he told Herod while Herod had come to the Jordan River listening to John. John the Baptist told Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." Now Herod recognized John as a man of God. Herod feared John because of his righteousness. Herod feared John because he saw John as a holy man, a man close to God. Herod Antipas feared the power of God. And Herod feared John the Baptist because it was clear John the Baptist had every desire to live right by God. And I can imagine Herod feeling that to be against John the Baptist, to be against John the Baptist, was to be against God. And Herod feared the power of God. So Herod protected John the Baptist. He would endeavor to make sure that no harm came to John the Baptist. But Herod's wife had a grudge against John the Baptist, because by publicly declaring that it was unlawful for Herod to have married Herodias, his brother's wife, in the eyes of Herodias, John the Baptist was shaming Herod and Herodias in public. In the eyes of Herodias, John the Baptist was dragging their names in the dirt. Now, it is not the heart of a godly man to magnify someone's sin, to put the focus on someone's sin. John was simply pointing out that Herod was in a position of leadership. Herod was in a position of authority, a position of influence. And by being in a position of influence, his decision to follow the sinful desires of his heart, John is making it clear that marrying his brother's wife was a reflection of him following the sinful desires of his heart. John is making a point. John is not trying to shame Herodias or Herod. John is trying to make a point that when someone in a position of leadership, in a position of authority, in a position of influence, when someone in that position follows the sinful desires of their heart, then their decision is going to influence people in their region. That's what happens when you are in a position of power, a position of influence. Your decisions influence others. And John is pointing this out. John is pointing out it is not right for a person in a position of influence to influence others with sinful decisions that turn people away from the heart of God. John the Baptist is spending his life pouring out what he receives from the mind and heart of God. And then you have Herod in a position of influence, in a leadership position. Herod Antipas is the ruler of Galilee and Pereira, and he is making a decision to live a life that is turned away from the heart of God, while John is spending his life pouring out what he receives from the mind and heart of God, so that people would turn towards the mind and heart of God and have minds and hearts that resemble God's heart. It must have really hurt John that he's spending his life being used by God to turn people towards God, and yet Herod Antipas is making decisions that are turning his heart away from God and influencing others to turn away from God. This is why John the Baptist is publicly pointing out the danger of what Herod is doing with his life. John is seeing things through a God's eye perspective, but Herodias is only seeing things through the short-sightedness of her own eyes and through the selfishness of her own short-sightedness. All she sees is John the Baptist publicly shaming her, disgracing her life decisions, which she believes are personal to her and none of John the Baptist's business. And because of this, her anger, her angst towards what she perceives as John the Baptist shaming her, it stirs up her sinful desire for John to be dead. Like the prophets before him, John the Baptist was being greatly used by God. Like the prophets before him, John the Baptist was pouring out what God was pouring into him. Now I have to say, what poured out of Jesus Christ was greater than what poured out of the prophets and John the Baptist. What poured out of Jesus Christ was greater than what poured out of anyone else, because what poured out of Jesus Christ was perfect because of who he was and where he came from.